On a freezing dawn in November 2018, a ranger patrolling the dense, fog-draped woods of Lake Crescent, Washington, was forced to slam on his brakes. A wild, emaciated man covered in scars stumbled from the shadows, violently begging for his life. I'm Leonard. In my 65 years exploring the globe's harshest terrains, I've learned that the wilderness isn't the deadliest thing out there. Human nature is. That feral man was Arthur Sterling, a ruthless, high-profile defense attorney who had vanished without a trace alongside his beautiful fiancée, Eleanor, 5 years prior. What the authorities eventually unearthed wasn't just a tragic survival story, but a twisted labyrinth of vengeance, broken justice, and a horrific betrayal made inside a cold steel bunker. Before we step into the darkness, let me know in the comments, what part of the world are you listening to this story from? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join our community of explorers. The city of Seattle, Washington was drenched in a cold, relentless November rain, the kind that seeps into your bones and washes the neon lights into a blurred smear across the pavement. But just a few hours west, nestled deep within the rugged Olympic Peninsula, the weather around Lake Crescent held a different kind of chill. A silent, heavy fog that swallowed the ancient pines and turned the deep glacial waters into a mirror of dark obsidian. It was into this profound isolation that Arthur Sterling and his fiancée, Eleanor Vance, drove their pristine black SUV. Arthur Sterling, at 42, was a man who wore his power like a tailored suit. He was striking in a sharp, predatory way. He stood an imposing 6'2", with a lean, athletic build maintained by expensive personal trainers. His hair was pitch black, slicked back flawlessly, with just a dusting of silver at the temples that only added to his distinguished, commanding aura. His eyes were his most defining feature, a pale, piercing blue that seemed entirely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a shark, calculating and unyielding. As one of the most high-profile and ruthless defense attorneys in the state, Arthur's personality was defined by his breathtaking arrogance and his emotional detachment. To him, the law wasn't about justice. It was a chessboard, and he never lost. This psychological armor had recently been reinforced by a highly publicized, deeply controversial victory. He had successfully defended a billionaire heir who, in a drunken stupor, had driven his sports car into a young woman named Lily Higgins. The 25-year-old had survived, but her legs were crushed beyond repair, leaving her bound to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The public was outraged, the media howled for blood, but Arthur had systematically destroyed the prosecution's case on a technicality. He didn't feel guilt. He felt the intoxicating high of invincibility. Sitting beside him in the passenger seat was Eleanor Vance. At 28, she was a vision of refined, undeniable beauty. Tall, slender, and possessing a dancer's grace, Eleanor had cascading auburn hair that framed a delicate porcelain complexion. Her eyes were large and expressive, a warm hazel that usually softened the sharp edges of the man she was about to marry. Despite being in the wilderness, she wore high-end designer outdoor apparel that looked completely untouched by actual dirt or sweat. Eleanor was ambitious, polished, and drawn to the magnetic pull of Arthur's success and wealth. However, she was willfully naive. She loved the comfortable, luxurious life Arthur provided, and actively chose to turn a blind eye to the moral cost of his career. The violent public backlash from the Higgins case had shaken her, and she had eagerly agreed to this isolated camping trip, desperately wanting to celebrate their upcoming wedding and pretend the anger of the world couldn't reach them. Their campsite was situated on a secluded, heavily wooded inlet on the northern shore of Lake Crescent. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but undeniably remote. As they pitched their lavish, oversized tent and set up their expensive gear, the silence of the woods pressed in on them. For Arthur, the silence was a trophy, a private domain he had purchased with his time and money. For Eleanor, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and the shadows stretched long and thin, the silence began to feel heavy. The first night passed with a deceptive calm. They drank expensive red wine by a crackling fire, the flames reflecting in Arthur's satisfied eyes. He spoke grandly of his victory in the courtroom, of the prosecutors he had humiliated, completely oblivious to the vast, indifferent darkness surrounding them. But as the fire died down to glowing embers, Eleanor felt the first prickle of unease. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation. The distinct, primal feeling of being watched. She pulled her thick wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, peering into the dense tree line. "Arthur?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. "Do you feel that?" Arthur chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. He poured the last of the wine into his glass. "It's just the woods, Elle. Raccoons, maybe a deer. We are at the top of the food chain out here, just like we are in the city. Relax." But the wilderness does not care about courtroom victories. By the second day, the underlying tension had thickened into a palpable dread. The woods seemed too quiet. No birds sang in the canopy above their camp. As dusk approached, the fog rolled in off the lake, thick and blinding, isolating them entirely from the rest of the world. That night, the feeling of being observed shifted from a vague suspicion to a suffocating certainty. Around 2 a.m., Eleanor was jolted awake. Beside her, Arthur was sitting bolt upright in his sleeping bag, his usual mask of supreme confidence entirely shattered. His pale blue eyes were wide, fixed on the nylon wall of their tent. There was a noise outside. It wasn't the scurry of a raccoon or the heavy, clumsy footfall of a black bear. It was the deliberate, rhythmic crunch of dry leaves and twigs. Footsteps. Bipedal, slow, and utterly methodical. They circled the tent once, then twice. A shadow, towering and misshapen, momentarily blocked out the faint moonlight filtering through the fabric. Arthur, the man who could talk his way out of any corner, found his throat paralyzed with a terror he had never known. He reached blindly for the heavy flashlight near his pack, his hands trembling violently. When dawn finally broke, painting the lake in hues of pale gold and slate gray, the campsite remained perfectly still. The expensive tent stood intact. A half-eaten breakfast of dehydrated fruit and oats sat cold on the folding table. Arthur's wallet, containing thousands of dollars in cash and platinum cards, lay untouched beside Eleanor's fully charged satellite phone. But Arthur and Eleanor were gone. They had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. The local police chief, Elias Thorne, received the missing persons report 2 days later from Eleanor's frantic mother. Chief Thorne was a man carved from the very landscape he protected. In his late 50s, with a burly, bear-like frame, a deeply weathered face, and a thick, bristly gray mustache, Thorne was a pragmatist. He had seen the woods claim careless hikers before, but his instincts, honed over 30 years of law enforcement, told him this was different. He was methodical, quiet, and possessed a deep respect for the unforgiving nature of the Olympic Peninsula. Thorne personally led the investigative team to the abandoned campsite. As he walked the perimeter, his heavy boots crunching softly on the pine needles, he found no signs of a struggle. No blood, no torn fabric. It was a pristine, undisturbed scene of sudden absence. The true, chilling nature of the disappearance only came to light when Thorne and his detectives executed a search warrant on Arthur Sterling's luxurious downtown Seattle office. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, they found a thick manila folder. Inside were dozens of threatening letters, printed on cheap, untraceable paper. They had been arriving daily since the conclusion of the Lily Higgins trial. Most were standard, angry rants from outraged citizens, but a few, marked by a disturbing clinical precision, caught Thorne's eye. They detailed Arthur's daily routines, Eleanor's favorite coffee shops, and, most terrifyingly, their itinerary for the Lake Crescent trip. The final letter, postmarked a week before their departure, contained only a single typed sentence. "The scales of justice are broken. So I will weigh your soul myself." Despite a massive search operation involving search and rescue dogs, dive teams scouring the murky depths of Lake Crescent, and helicopters scanning the dense canopy, not a single trace of the couple was ever found. No footprints leading away from the camp, no discarded clothing. As the months bled into a year, the media frenzy died down. The wealthy defense attorney and his beautiful bride-to-be became a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered around campfires in the Pacific Northwest. The case of Arthur and Eleanor was eventually boxed up and moved to the cold case archives, leaving behind a chilling reminder that the pride and power of the civilized world mean absolutely nothing when you step into the realm of darkness.
"5 years is a remarkably long time for a ghost to remain silent."
It was a bitterly cold Tuesday in early December, the frost clinging fiercely to the black asphalt of Highway 101 as it wound its way around the jagged edge of Lake Crescent. Deputy Sarah Miller was nearing the exhausted end of a grueling graveyard shift, the heater in her police cruiser blasting dry, stale air into her face to keep her awake. Sarah, a 26-year-old rookie, possessed an athletic, tightly coiled frame and straw-blonde hair strictly secured in a regulation bun. Raised by a father and 2 older brothers who were all veteran state troopers, her personality was forged in the fires of rigid discipline and earnest, unwavering duty. She was deeply empathetic, but possessed a by-the-book rigidity, an emotional and professional shield she wore constantly to prove herself in a demanding, male-dominated precinct. However, absolutely no amount of rigorous academy training could have prepared her for the nightmare that suddenly and violently materialized in the cone of her headlights. Without a single warning, a figure lunged from the dense, fog-choked tree line directly into the path of her rushing vehicle. Sarah slammed both feet on the brakes, the cruiser's tires shrieking agonizingly against the frozen asphalt, stopping mere inches from the apparition. It was a man, though the word barely applied to the wreck standing before her. He was a feral, severely emaciated creature, shivering violently in the freezing rain. His hair was a matted, waist-length tangle of filth, leaves, and dried blood, and his body was wrapped in filthy, rotting rags that exposed skin stretched impossibly tight over protruding ribs. Scars, both old, jagged lines and fresh, weeping sores, covered his bare arms and face. His eyes, however, were the most terrifying part. They were wide, frantic, and entirely devoid of any recognizable sanity. As Sarah drew her service weapon, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, the creature slammed his bloody, dirt-caked hands against the hood of the cruiser, leaving smeared, crimson handprints. He didn't attack. Instead, he collapsed heavily to his scarred knees, his voice a gravelly, broken sob as he begged her to save him, his words a jumbled, hysterical mess of apologies and sheer, unadulterated terror. Within a few short hours, the sleepy local precinct was completely transformed into a chaotic hive of activity as the feral man was transported to the secure, heavily guarded wing of the county hospital. His DNA rushed urgently through the National Emergency Database. Chief Elias Thorne, looking every bit of his 60-plus years, with deeper, sorrowful lines etched around his mouth and a heavier slump to his broad, bear-like shoulders, stood outside the hospital room, staring through the thick observation glass. The rapid DNA test had returned a staggering, fundamentally impossible match. Arthur Sterling, the ruthless, impeccably groomed, and impossibly arrogant defense attorney who had vanished without a trace half a decade ago, was now strapped tightly to a sterile hospital bed, thrashing violently against the thick leather restraints. Attending him was Dr. Simon Gable, a tall, impeccably neat emergency room physician in his mid-40s, whose usually calm, unflappable demeanor, formed by years of trauma ward experience, was clearly shaken by the sheer brutality of Arthur's physical degradation. Dr. Gable noted that Arthur's fingernails were entirely torn away, the nail beds caked with dark rust and dried blood, and several of the scars on his forearms looked suspiciously like desperate, self-inflicted tally marks. The medical staff had heavily sedated him, but the powerful drugs barely dented his manic, overwhelming panic. As Thorne cautiously entered the room, Arthur's pale blue eyes, once so cold, calculating and full of legal superiority, snapped toward the police chief, filled with a raw, animalistic desperation. Arthur lunged violently against the straps, his vocal cords tearing as he shrieked. He didn't ask for water, a lawyer, or food. He pleaded, his voice a grating, painful rasp. He babbled incoherently about her, about the suffocating darkness that eats the hours, and repeated a terrifying, obsessive phrase. The bloody choice. He wept uncontrollably, spitting out pleas for Thorne to find the steel cellar and save Eleanor. Survival, it seemed, had demanded the complete and utter sacrifice of his towering pride, his coherent memory, and a large portion of his humanity. The polished, unbeatable lawyer was completely dead. Only a terrified, broken shell of a man remained. His fragmented memory yielded no specific coordinates, only sensory horrors of endlessly dripping water, the metallic stench of rust, the agonizing sound of Eleanor weeping in the pitch blackness, and the agonizing guilt of a choice he couldn't fully articulate. The sudden, electrifying realization that Eleanor Vance might still be alive, trapped and breathing in some subterranean hell for 5 unimaginably long years, sent a shockwave of spreading horror through the room, instantly transforming the dead cold case into a blistering, high-stakes race against the clock. Leaving the sterile confines of the hospital with a heavy, frantic energy, Thorne sped back to the precinct, barking loud orders into his radio to pull every single box of archived files related to both the Arthur Sterling disappearance and the Lily Higgins vehicular assault case. He was joined in the stifling, fluorescent-lit archives room by Detective Ray Garner. Garner was a minor, though crucial character in the grand scheme of the department, a 48-year-old balding investigator with a dense, stocky build, a perpetually rumpled brown suit, and a deeply cynical, chain-smoking habit. Despite his world-weary and intentionally abrasive personality, cultivated through decades of dealing with the absolute dregs of society, Garner possessed a mind like a steel trap when it came to property records, tax trails, and hidden assets. As the two men pored obsessively over the victim statements and old suspect lists, coughing in the dusty air, the narrative of the case began to violently shift. Thorne recalled the chillingly precise threatening letters found in Arthur's downtown Seattle office 5 years ago, the ones promising a deeply personal, biblical reckoning. They pulled the dusty file on Martha Higgins, Lily's mother. Staring up from a 5-year-old printed driver's license photo was Martha, a woman in her mid-50s with a sharply angled face, her once soft features deeply hollowed by insurmountable grief, and eyes that burned with a cold, unrelenting fire. Martha was a retired structural engineer, a highly intelligent woman whose life had been utterly destroyed the day Arthur Sterling manipulated the legal system to set her daughter's attacker totally free. While she had maintained an airtight, seemingly flawless alibi for the exact week Arthur and Eleanor vanished, Garner's nicotine-stained fingers traced over a financial audit buried deep in the appendices of the old investigation. Years before the tragic accident, Martha's late husband, an eccentric Cold War history enthusiast, had purchased a massive, heavily forested, completely off-the-grid plot of land deep in the Olympic Peninsula, barely 10 miles from the shores of Lake Crescent. It was supposedly barren, undevelopable land, entirely ignored during the initial, massive search grids because there were absolutely no registered residential structures on it. But Martha was an expert engineer. If she wanted to build a nightmare off the books, or repurpose an old bunker, she had the precise technical knowledge to do it seamlessly. The passive, decades-old investigation instantly ignited into a furious tactical offensive. Thorne's seasoned law enforcement intuition screamed that they had just found the exact location of the steel cellar. The quiet precinct erupted into full tactical mobilization as the regional SWAT team was called in, heavily armored vehicles rolling aggressively out of the bay as a pale, freezing dawn broke over the mountains. Driven by the fervent, agonizing belief that Eleanor Vance was still breathing down in the suffocating dark, and guided only by the frantic, terrified ramblings of a broken Arthur Sterling, the massive police convoy tore down the highway toward the abandoned Higgins property, the deafening siren wails slicing sharply through the heavy, indifferent silence of the Washington woods.
The Olympic Peninsula woods were practically vibrating with the deafening roar of the armored Bearcat vehicle as it tore through the overgrown, nearly invisible logging road leading to the abandoned Higgins property.
The pale, freezing dawn did little to penetrate the suffocating canopy of ancient pines, casting the tactical operation in a shroud of deep, melancholic blue. Chief Elias Thorne rode in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Beside him, preparing his gear with mechanical, emotionless precision, was Commander Vance "Viper" Hayes, the leader of the regional SWAT team. Hayes was a 45-year-old veteran whose entire adult life had been defined by high-stakes hostage rescue. He stood a formidable 6'4", with a heavily muscled, intimidating frame wrapped tightly in black Kevlar. His head was completely shaved, emphasizing a pale, jagged scar that sliced diagonally through his left eyebrow, a permanent souvenir from a close-quarters knife fight years prior. Hayes possessed a ruthlessly pragmatic, ice-cold personality, shaped entirely by years of witnessing the darkest capabilities of violent criminals. He suppressed all external emotion to maintain absolute tactical control. Working off a long, taut lead ahead of the breaching team was Zeus, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois attached to the K9 unit. Zeus possessed a sleek, muscular fawn coat, a striking black mask, and intense, hyper-focused amber eyes. Highly disciplined and bred for pure utility, the dog was a furry missile of pure kinetic energy, tasked with finding the exact point of entry in a landscape designed to hide secrets. As the tactical team disembarked and formed a tight, silent perimeter around a specific coordinate on the topographic map, Zeus began to exhibit a frantic, highly agitated behavior near a seemingly natural mound of moss-covered rocks and dead pine needles at the base of a massive ridge. He whined sharply, scratching furiously at the damp earth. Commander Hayes signaled his men forward. It took 10 minutes of aggressive digging to unearth the horrible truth. The rocks were artificial, expertly crafted fiberglass facades concealing a heavy, reinforced steel blast door set directly into the earth. It was a leftover relic of Cold War paranoia, brilliantly repurposed by a structural engineer into an invisible tomb. Thorne felt a surge of burning, desperate hope ignite in his chest. Eleanor Vance had to be on the other side of that door. Hayes attached shaped breaching charges to the heavy steel hinges and the locking mechanism, motioning for everyone to fall back. The explosion was a concussive, deafening thump that shook the frozen ground, instantly blowing the heavy steel door inward with a violent screech of tearing metal. Black, stagnant air immediately vomited out of the opening. The tactical team surged forward into the abyss, their mounted rifle lights slicing through the pitch-black, suffocating darkness, shouting loud, booming commands of, "Police, show your hands!" However, the bunker did not answer with the frantic cries of a hostage or the hostile gunfire of a kidnapper. It answered with an oppressive, tomb-like silence. The interior reeked of dampness, creeping black mold, human waste, and the distinct, coppery stench of old rust. As the SWAT team rapidly cleared the small concrete labyrinth, a main living area, a primitive chemical bathroom, and a small storage alcove, the burning hope in Thorne's chest rapidly extinguished, replaced by a chilling, paralyzing despair. Eleanor was not there. The bunker was entirely empty of human life. Lowering his weapon, Thorne stepped slowly into the main room, his heavy boots crunching on scattered, unidentifiable debris. The space was a masterclass in psychological depravity. There were exactly 2 old rusted iron beds pushed against opposite damp concrete walls, their thin, filthy mattresses stained with dark, questionable fluids. On the wall between them, scratched deeply into the gray concrete with what appeared to be fingernails and smeared in dried, dark brown blood, were hundreds of frantic, uneven tally marks, counting the agonizing passage of days in the dark. But it was the horrifying centerpiece of the room that made Thorne's breath catch in his throat, freezing the blood in his veins. Positioned perfectly in the exact center of the room, illuminated by the intersecting beams of a half-dozen tactical flashlights, sat a vintage, heavy-duty medical wheelchair. It was an exact, chilling replica of the one Lily Higgins was permanently confined to after Arthur Sterling had helped her drunken attacker walk free. Draped over the cracked vinyl seat and securely tied to the metal armrests with thick, abrasive zip ties was Eleanor's designer engagement dress. The once pristine, expensive white fabric was now filthy, violently torn, and covered in dark, unmistakable spatters of dried blood. Looking at the horrific tableau, the seasoned police chief realized with sickening clarity that this subterranean concrete box was not merely a holding cell for ransom. It was a meticulously designed theater of profound, calculated torment. Every detail, from the exact number of beds to the symbolic wheelchair, was a twisted reflection of Arthur's arrogance in the courtroom. What Arthur had sown, using legal loopholes and a complete lack of empathy, had returned to haunt him in its most distorted, agonizing form. The kidnapper hadn't just stolen Arthur's fiancée. They had forced him to live in the physical manifestation of the pain he had caused someone else. The hope of a heroic, last-minute rescue shattered completely into a million jagged pieces. Eleanor was gone, and the sheer cruelty of the scene suggested she had not met a merciful end. Armed with the horrifying discovery of the bunker on property legally owned by Martha Higgins, the police finally had the sufficient, albeit largely circumstantial, grounds to act. Chief Thorne immediately radioed dispatch, his voice a low, dangerous growl, ordering an immediate summons and detention of Martha Higgins for intense questioning. But there was one final, deeply tragic duty Thorne had to perform before returning to the precinct. He drove the grim, silent miles back to the county hospital, the image of the blood-stained dress burning behind his eyelids. He found Arthur Sterling in the same heavily guarded room, the sedatives wearing off, leaving the feral man in a state of hyper-vigilant, twitching terror. Dr. Gable stood quietly in the corner as Thorne pulled a plastic chair to the edge of the bed. When Thorne gently but firmly delivered the news that they had breached the steel cellar and found it empty, save for the wheelchair and the dress, the reaction was utterly catastrophic. Arthur did not cry. He stopped breathing for a terrifyingly long moment. His pale blue eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black. Then, Arthur let out a scream that did not sound human. It was an endless, gut-wrenching shriek of a soul being ripped apart, a sound of absolute, bottomless panic. He thrashed against the heavy leather restraints with such violent, desperate force that the thick straps audibly groaned, his bloody wrists straining to the point of breaking. He screamed Eleanor's name over and over, thrashing until his monitor alarms blared wildly and the medical staff rushed in with syringes to forcefully sedate him again. As the chemical darkness pulled Arthur back under, Thorne watched the broken lawyer go limp, realizing that whatever horrific choice Arthur had made in the dark, the punishment was far from over.
The interrogation room at the county precinct was a claustrophobic, windowless box, illuminated by a single set of harsh, buzzing neon tube lights that cast a sickly, greenish pallor over everything.
Sitting perfectly still at the center of the scratched metal table was Martha Higgins. Unlike the frantic, broken man chained to a hospital bed across town, Martha exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying serenity. She wore a simple, immaculately pressed charcoal gray cardigan over a high-necked blouse. Her hands, resting lightly on the tabletop, did not tremble. Across from her sat Chief Elias Thorne, his heavy, bear-like frame tense, and a newly arrived figure representing the full, frustrated weight of the local justice system. District Attorney Robert Callahan. Callahan was a man in his late 50s, noticeably overweight, with a perpetually flushed, sweating face that seemed to swell whenever he was angry. He wore an expensive but ill-fitting navy pinstripe suit that strained against his gut. A deeply politically motivated prosecutor, Callahan cared far more about his conviction rates and media optics than the philosophical concept of justice. He was abrasive, easily flustered, and heavily relied on intimidation tactics, making him the absolute worst possible adversary for the cold, calculating intellect of the woman sitting across from him. "Let's drop the act, Mrs. Higgins," Callahan barked, slamming a thick manila folder onto the metal table, sending a sharp echo through the small room. He leaned over her, his face damp with perspiration. "We found the bunker. We found it on a plot of land deeded exclusively in your name. We found the wheelchair, the dress, and the blood. We have Arthur Sterling in a hospital room identifying you as his kidnapper. You are going to prison for the rest of your natural life, unless you tell us exactly where Eleanor Vance is right now." Martha did not flinch. She blinked slowly, her cold, hollowed eyes tracking a bead of sweat as it rolled down Callahan's red cheek. "Mr. Sterling identified me?" she asked, her voice quiet, steady, and razor-sharp. "A man you found wandering the woods, eating dirt and hallucinating? A man your own medical examiners have pumped full of antipsychotics just to stop him from chewing his own tongue off? Is that your star witness, Mr. Callahan?" "You own the property," Thorne interjected, his voice much lower, trying to anchor the interrogation before Callahan lost control. "My late husband bought a patch of useless dirt 20 years ago," Martha replied smoothly, not looking away from Callahan. "I haven't set foot on it since his funeral. If some vagrants or survivalists repurposed a Cold War relic on unfenced, unmonitored land, that is a tragedy, Chief Thorne. But it is not a crime committed by me." She paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip from the paper cup of water in front of her. "Furthermore, my attorney has already faxed over the time-stamped security footage and credit card receipts, proving I was attending a grief counseling retreat in Sedona, Arizona during the entire week Arthur and Eleanor went missing. Do you have my DNA in that bunker? Do you have my fingerprints? Or do you just have an angry man's speculation?" As the word speculation hung in the stale air of the interrogation room, miles away, in the sterile, beeping confines of the intensive care unit, Arthur Sterling was drowning in his own chemically induced memories. The heavy sedatives had pushed him under, but his mind was permanently trapped in the pitch-black void of the steel cellar. In the dark, there were rules. The kidnapper never spoke with a human voice, never showed a face, and never opened the heavy steel door. Arthur's memory violently manifested the horror of feeding time. In the total darkness, a loud, heavy mechanical clank would echo through the concrete box, the sound of a small, heavily armored slot sliding open at the bottom of the main door. A harsh, blinding strip of LED light would slice into the room, illuminating a small metal tray pushed through the gap. Then, an automated, synthesized voice would crackle from the hidden speaker in the ceiling. "Food for one." On the tray there was never a feast. It was always agonizingly minimal. A single protein bar, a small bowl of cold, watery oatmeal, 1 cup of stale water. For the first few weeks, the civilized, arrogant Arthur Sterling had tried to maintain his humanity. He had broken the protein bars exactly in half, offering Eleanor the larger portion. He had held her in the freezing dark, whispering hollow promises that he would use all his wealth and power to hunt down whoever was doing this. But the human body cannot survive on promises, and starvation is a relentless, vicious predator that devours morality. As the months dragged into years, the gnawing, acidic pain in Arthur's stomach became the only truth he knew. The memory shifted to a horrifying climax. The clank of the slot, the blinding light, a single, half-moldy piece of bread on the tray. Arthur remembered the animalistic surge of adrenaline. He remembered lunging for the tray, his hands colliding with Eleanor's in the harsh strip of light. He remembered the sickening sound of a struggle, not between a loving couple, but between two starving, feral dogs fighting over a scrap of bone. He remembered shoving the woman he was supposed to marry hard against the damp concrete wall, snatching the bread and shoving it into his own mouth, swallowing it whole, while she wept weakly in the corner. The kidnapper had not just locked Arthur away. They had meticulously, perfectly stripped away his pride, his superiority, and his humanity, reducing the unbeatable lawyer to a selfish, pathetic animal who would trample his true love for a mouthful of mold. Back under the buzzing neon lights of the precinct, Martha Higgins was delivering the final, fatal blow to the prosecution's case. Callahan was breathing heavily, his intimidation tactics crumbling against her absolute stoicism. "You built a torture chamber!" Callahan yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "You planned this for months after the trial!" "Speculation," Martha repeated, a ghost of a bitter, triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You know, Mr. Callahan, 5 years ago I sat in a courtroom and watched Arthur Sterling dismantle the case against the drunk driver who crushed my daughter's spine. The prosecution had a blood alcohol test. They had witnesses. But Mr. Sterling smiled, adjusted his expensive tie, and told the jury that the chain of custody for the blood sample was flawed. He argued that the tire tracks were circumstantial. He told the judge that without absolute, direct, irrefutable evidence, justice demands the release of the accused." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Chief Thorne's. "Arthur Sterling taught me a very valuable lesson about your system. The truth doesn't matter at all. The law is just a tool. It only matters what you can prove on paper." Silence descended on the room. Thorne looked at the file. She was right. Her alibi for the abduction window was airtight. The forensic team had scoured the bunker. There was no DNA, no hair, no fingerprints belonging to Martha Higgins. Whoever had maintained the bunker and fed the prisoners had worn hazmat suits and operated with clinical, forensic perfection. They had a mountain of motive, an ocean of circumstantial connections, and absolutely zero direct evidence connecting her physically to the kidnapping or the bunker. Callahan wiped his sweating forehead with a trembling hand, his political bravado entirely deflated. He looked at Thorne, a silent, sickening acknowledgement passing between them. They were completely paralyzed. The justice system, with all its rigid rules and requirements, was utterly powerless against a cold, ruthless mind with nothing left to lose. An hour later, the heavy glass doors of the police precinct slid open. Martha Higgins walked out into the freezing December night, adjusting her charcoal cardigan against the wind. Chief Thorne stood by the front desk, watching her disappear into the shadows of the parking lot. His fists were clenched so hard his knuckles were white. The net of justice had just been forced to open, releasing the villain right back into the world. Exactly the way Arthur Sterling had done it 5 years ago.
The secure psychiatric wing of the county hospital was a masterclass in sterile, suffocating silence. A stark contrast to the chaotic howling of the freezing Washington wind battling against the reinforced glass windows.
In Observation Room 4B, Chief Elias Thorne stood with his arms crossed tightly over his broad chest, his jaw set in a grim, unyielding line as he stared through the two-way mirror. The release of Martha Higgins had tasted like ash in his mouth, a bitter pill of legal defeat that left the department with absolutely nothing but a traumatized, incoherent survivor. The only remaining key to uncovering the ultimate fate of Eleanor Vance was buried deep within the fractured, heavily guarded subconscious of Arthur Sterling. To retrieve it, the department had brought in Dr. Julian Mercer. Mercer was a clinical psychologist renowned nationwide for his controversial but highly effective work in deep hypnotic regression and severe trauma recovery. At 58, Dr. Mercer was a striking, almost bird-like figure. He was impossibly tall and gaunt, dressed in a meticulously tailored tweed three-piece suit that smelled faintly of antique paper and sandalwood. His hair was a shock of thick, silvery white, combed sharply back from a high forehead, and he peered at the world through perfectly round, wire-rimmed spectacles. Mercer possessed a clinical, emotionally detached personality. He did not view his patients with warm empathy, but rather as intricate, broken clocks that required careful, methodical dismantling to find the damaged gear. He was famously patient, speaking in a rhythmic, hypnotic baritone that could soothe a cornered animal. Nothing shocked him, and nothing moved him to pity. He was the perfect, terrifyingly calm anchor for a man drifting in a sea of madness. Inside the stark white treatment room, Arthur Sterling sat slumped in a heavily padded recliner. The physical restraints had been removed, replaced by the heavy, invisible weight of pharmaceutical sedatives. He looked incredibly fragile, his hollowed cheeks covered in a patchy, coarse beard, his pale blue eyes darting frantically at invisible shadows in the corners of the room. Dr. Mercer sat across from him, his long, spider-like fingers steepled beneath his chin. There was no swinging pocket watch, no theatrical swinging pendulum. Mercer relied solely on the cadence of his voice and the rhythmic, steady tapping of his polished leather shoe against the linoleum floor. He began the induction slowly, guiding Arthur's erratic breathing to match his own, instructing him to visualize a staircase descending into the darkest, most hidden basement of his mind. As Mercer counted backward from 10, the frantic twitching in Arthur's scarred hands gradually ceased. His eyelids fluttered heavily, fighting a losing battle against the psychological weight of Mercer's suggestions, until they finally closed shut. The transition from the sterile hospital room to the haunting depths of the past was seamless. Mercer did not ask broad questions. He used precise, surgical inquiries to navigate the labyrinth of Arthur's trauma, pushing past the agonizing memories of starvation and the torturous, automated voice that delivered their meager rations. He guided Arthur directly to the anomaly, the day the pattern broke. The day Arthur Sterling suddenly appeared on Highway 101. Under the deep, hypnotic trance, Arthur's breathing grew shallow and ragged. A cold sweat broke out across his pallid forehead. He was no longer in the hospital. The sterile scent of antiseptic was instantly, violently replaced by the suffocating, metallic stench of rust, black mold, and human decay. He was back in the steel cellar. It was the end. 5 years of absolute, sensory-deprived hell had systematically stripped away every single layer of the civilized, arrogant defense attorney, leaving behind a pathetic, hollowed-out beast driven entirely by the reptilian brain. In the darkness of his memory, Arthur could hear Eleanor breathing heavily in the opposite corner of the freezing concrete box. The love that had once brought them to the pristine shores of Lake Crescent had long since died, starved to death in the dark. It had been replaced by a quiet, simmering resentment. They were no longer fiancés. They were desperate competitors in a sick, sadistic game of survival, fighting over moldy crumbs and droplets of water. Then, the eternal, suffocating silence of the bunker was shattered by a sound that made Arthur's emaciated body seize with pure, unadulterated shock. It was not the familiar mechanical clank of the food slot. It was the heavy, grinding screech of massive gears turning, followed by the deafening hiss of depressurization. The main blast door, the impenetrable steel wall that had sealed their tomb for half a decade, was slowly, agonizingly groaning open. A blinding, agonizingly bright shaft of pure white daylight sliced violently into the concrete room, burning Arthur's darkness-acclimated eyes like physical acid. He threw his scarred hands up to shield his face, a raw, wet gasp tearing from his ruined throat. In the opposite corner, Eleanor let out a weak, confused whimper, trying to crawl across the damp floor toward the light. Then, the automated, synthesized voice crackled through the hidden ceiling speaker, its volume cranked to a deafening, echoing pitch. "The scales are tipped," the voice boomed, completely devoid of human emotion. "Only one person is allowed to leave. Run, or I will close the door forever." In the observation room, Chief Thorne leaned closer to the glass, the breath freezing in his lungs. In the treatment chair, Arthur's physical body began to tremble violently, tears leaking from his tightly shut eyes, his chest heaving with phantom exertion. Inside the memory, the heavy steel door immediately began to hum, the massive hydraulic hinges slowly reversing, threatening to seal the tomb shut once again. Panic, pure, absolute, and blindingly selfish, completely overwhelmed Arthur Sterling. Every moral code, every vow of love, every shred of human decency he had ever claimed to possess evaporated in a nanosecond, incinerated by the overwhelming, desperate biological imperative to survive. He scrambled to his hands and knees, scrambling toward the narrowing gap of daylight like a feral dog. Eleanor, weeping hysterically, managed to grab the shredded hem of his filthy shirt. "Arthur, please, help me up. We have to go together," she screamed, her voice a fragile, broken reed. She was weak, her body failing, her grip desperate. If he stopped to haul her up, if he tried to support her dead weight through the heavy doorway, the closing steel slab would crush them both, or trap them inside forever. Arthur looked down at the woman he had asked to marry him. He saw her sunken eyes, her bleeding fingernails, her utter helplessness. In that split second, the facade of the powerful, protective attorney shattered entirely. He didn't see the love of his life. He saw an anchor. He saw a weight that was going to drag him back into the agonizing, starving dark. With a guttural roar of animalistic terror, Arthur Sterling violently twisted his body, raising his heavy, boot-clad foot, and kicked Eleanor squarely in the chest. The force of the desperate blow sent her flying backward, her frail body hitting the damp concrete wall with a sickening, hollow thud. As she collapsed onto the filthy floor, gasping for the breath he had just knocked out of her, Arthur lunged through the rapidly closing gap. The moment he cleared the threshold, feeling the freezing bite of the Washington wind on his face, a new, horrifying instinct seized him. If she managed to crawl out, the voice might punish them both. He could not risk it. Grabbing the heavy, rusted exterior locking lever, Arthur slammed it downward with all his remaining strength, driving the thick steel deadbolt into place just as the hydraulic door hissed shut. He locked her in. He sealed the tomb with his own hands to guarantee his freedom, drowning out her muffled screams with the sound of his own frantic, gasping laughter as he sprinted blindly into the woods. "Arthur, wake up!" Dr. Mercer's voice sliced sharply through the clinical silence of the hospital room, a sharp, commanding snap of his fingers breaking the hypnotic tether. Arthur's eyes flew open, wide and bloodshot. He did not wake up slowly. He erupted from the recliner, thrashing against the empty air, a scream of absolute, soul-shattering horror tearing from his throat. It was the scream of a man who had just looked into a mirror and seen a monster staring back. He collapsed onto the linoleum floor, curling into a tight, shivering fetal position, vomiting bile as the full, unsuppressed weight of his betrayal crushed his psyche. Behind the two-way glass, Chief Thorne felt a cold, creeping disgust wash over him, entirely extinguishing the lingering pity he had felt for the victim. Arthur was not a tragic, romantic hero who had lost his bride to a maniac. He was a coward, a traitor who had sacrificed the woman he loved to save his own miserable skin. Fear had not just broken him. It had revealed the ugly, rot-infested core of his soul. Martha Higgins had designed a flawless psychological masterpiece. She had not needed to murder Eleanor Vance or bloody her own hands. She had simply created the perfect, agonizing conditions for Arthur Sterling to do it for her. He was free from the physical confines of the bunker, and no court of law could easily convict a man for actions taken under extreme, life-threatening duress. But as Arthur wailed on the sterile floor, tearing at his own hair and begging a God he didn't believe in for forgiveness, it was entirely clear that the trial was already over. He had been permanently sentenced to the eternal, inescapable prison of his own conscience. Exactly 1 year had bled away since the horrifying truth of the steel cellar had been laid bare under the clinical lights of the psychiatric ward.
For the rest of the world, the tragic, bizarre saga of the arrogant defense attorney and his vanished bride had slowly faded into the obscure, dusty archives of true crime podcasts and forgotten newspaper clippings.
But for Arthur Sterling, time had entirely ceased to move. He was no longer the polished, invincible legal shark of Seattle, nor was he the feral, thrashing beast pulled from the freezing Washington woods. He had mutated into something far more pathetic, a ghost haunting his own ruined life. Arthur resided in a squalid, damp studio apartment on the neglected, rain-slicked fringes of Aberdeen. The room perpetually reeked of cheap, bottom-shelf whiskey, stale sweat, and the sharp chemical odor of bleach. The trauma of the bunker had manifested into a crippling, inescapable obsessive-compulsive disorder. Every single day, Arthur weighed his meager portions of canned food on a digital kitchen scale, terrifyingly unable to consume more than a few ounces at a time, his brain permanently wired to the starvation rations of the dark. He spent hours compulsively checking the 3 heavy deadbolts he had installed on his flimsy apartment door, locking and unlocking them in a frantic, bleeding rhythm until his scarred knuckles were raw. He was a vagabond in his own mind, drowning his paralyzing guilt in alcohol just to buy a few hours of dreamless, suffocating sleep. Deep in his rotting core, Arthur desperately craved punishment. He wanted a judge to slam a wooden gavel. He wanted to be locked in a maximum security prison cell with iron bars and strict, undeniable boundaries. He wanted the state to execute him for the unforgivable cowardice of kicking the woman he loved into the abyss to save himself. But the legal system, the very machine he had manipulated his entire career, offered him no such absolution. The official investigation had ground to a miserable, indefinite halt. Chief Elias Thorne had relentlessly pursued every conceivable lead, but the circumstantial evidence surrounding the bunker was entirely insufficient for a grand jury indictment. The case was officially suspended. Adding a thick, impenetrable layer of ice to the cold case, Martha Higgins and her wheelchair-bound daughter Lily had flawlessly vanished. Shortly after Martha's release from the interrogation room, all of their known properties, including the heavily forested plot containing the bunker, were quietly liquidated through a complex web of blind trusts and offshore shell companies. They left no forwarding address, no financial footprint, and absolutely no digital trace. They had evaporated into the vast, indifferent expanse of the country, taking the absolute truth with them. Arthur was left utterly alone, suffocating in a legal and moral purgatory, where his agonizing survival felt like the most brutal death sentence imaginable. The heavy, oppressive silence of Arthur's personal hell was broken on the exact 1-year anniversary of his disappearance at Lake Crescent. The coastal rain was lashing violently against his single, grimy window when a sudden, sharp knock echoed at his door. Arthur froze, his heart seizing in his hollow chest. He crept to the peephole, his breath fogging the glass. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Frank, the building's exhausted postal worker. Frank was a 62-year-old man with a severe arthritic limp, a deeply weathered face mapping decades of harsh Pacific Northwest winters, and a personality entirely muted by years of invisible, repetitive labor. He was a profoundly apathetic man who wore his faded blue uniform like a heavy shroud, caring absolutely nothing for the ghosts haunting the miserable tenants on his route. He only cared about finishing his shift and collecting his meager pension. Frank unceremoniously slid a crisp, stark white envelope under the door gap before limping away down the peeling corridor. Arthur stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. His trembling, scarred hands hesitated before finally snatching it from the cracked linoleum. There was no return address. His name was typed on the front in a painfully standard clinical font. Tearing the heavy paper open, Arthur extracted a single high-resolution, glossy photograph. The image did not depict the gruesome, blood-stained horrors he saw every time he closed his eyes, which only made the visual shock infinitely more devastating. A twist of absolute, incomprehensible psychological violence overturned every logical prediction in Arthur's shattered mind. The photograph was of Eleanor Vance. She was not the skeletal, filthy, weeping victim he had brutally kicked to the concrete floor and locked in the dark. She looked breathtakingly radiant, perhaps even healthier and more vibrant than she had been on the day they drove to Lake Crescent. She was standing in the center of a lush, sun-drenched, exquisitely manicured garden, bursting with blooming hydrangeas and creeping ivy. She was wearing a simple, elegant summer dress, and her auburn hair caught the golden afternoon light perfectly. Her face was turned toward the camera, and she was smiling, a gentle, serene, completely unburdened smile that reached her warm hazel eyes. But the true, paralyzing horror of the image lay directly in front of her. Eleanor's hands, perfectly manicured and unscarred, were resting lightly on the push handles of a vintage, heavy-duty medical wheelchair.
It was the exact same model of wheelchair that had sat in the center of the steel cellar, the exact same model Lily Higgins was confined to. And the wheelchair was completely empty. Arthur's breath hitched in a violent, wet gasp as he flipped the glossy photograph over. Written on the pristine white back, in elegant, looping cursive ink, was a single, devastating sentence. The sentence has been carried out. Logic instantly evaporated, replaced by an extreme, freezing bewilderment that swallowed Arthur whole. He stumbled backward, his trembling legs giving way, collapsing onto his unmade mattress. He frantically carried the photograph to the local precinct, bursting into Chief Thorne's office in a hysterical, weeping frenzy. But the justice system was just as blind and powerless as Arthur was. Thorne and his digital forensics team analyzed the image for days, yet they could provide no solid comfort. The paper and ink were generic, untraceable brands purchased from any commercial print shop in the country. The background foliage was too common to pinpoint a geographic location. The terrifying ambiguity of the photograph ripped Arthur's fragile sanity to absolute shreds, presenting three distinct, equally horrific theories that circled his brain like starving vultures. The first theory suggested an outcome of twisted, poetic mercy. Had Martha Higgins somehow retrieved Eleanor from the bunker after Arthur's cowardly escape, nursing her back to health, but methodically brainwashing her? Had the psychological trauma broken Eleanor's mind, transforming the pampered socialite into a voluntary, indentured caregiver for Lily Higgins to atone for Arthur's original, sickening legal victory? Was the empty wheelchair a symbol that Eleanor had fully embraced her new, subservient life? The second theory was a nightmare of sheer, vengeful cruelty. What if Eleanor had survived the kick to the chest and the locking of the blast door, and in the suffocating darkness of betrayal, all her love for Arthur had curdled into pure, unadulterated hatred? What if she had willingly joined forces with Martha Higgins the moment she was released, becoming an active, cruel accomplice in Arthur's ongoing torture? That gentle, serene smile in the sunlight could be the ultimate weapon of a woman who knew exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage on the man who had left her to die. The third theory was perhaps the most chilling in its modern, clinical detachment. What if Eleanor truly was dead, her bones rotting away in the pitch-black dampness of the steel cellar? What if the photograph was nothing but a brilliant, flawless deepfake, an AI-generated or heavily photoshopped masterpiece meticulously crafted by Martha Higgins to serve as the final, fatal turn of the screw? A digital ghost designed specifically to torture Arthur, dangling the impossible possibility of his fiancée's survival just out of reach, pushing him toward the sharp edge of suicide. The police could not verify a single theory. They handed the photograph back to Arthur, their faces masks of pity and uncomfortable defeat, and quietly closed the file once again.
The truth was not a clean, definitive answer. It was a living, breathing ghost that would cling to Arthur's mind until his last ragged breath. There would be no trial, no prison cell, and absolutely no closure. The narrative faded entirely into the dark, silent corners of the world, returning to the damp, squalid apartment in Aberdeen. The final image of Arthur Sterling was not of a powerful lawyer in a courtroom, nor a survivor conquering the wild. He was a broken, weeping shell, kneeling in the middle of a room reeking of whiskey, clutching a glossy photograph of a sun-drenched garden to his chest, utterly consumed by an inescapable, infinite madness from which he would never, ever wake up.
My friends, as we step out of the cold shadows of Lake Crescent and back into the warmth of our own lives, there's a quiet truth we must carry with us. Most of us will never face a dark bunker or a terrifying choice in the freezing wild. But every single day, we face small moments that test our character.
Do we choose our own pride, or do we reach out a helping hand to someone in need?
Arthur Sterling thought his power and wealth made him untouchable, but he forgot that the ultimate judge is a peaceful conscience. In our daily routines, let us choose kindness over arrogance. Let us take responsibility for our mistakes and fiercely protect the people we love. True survival is not just about keeping your body breathing. It is about keeping your humanity whole.
If this story gave you something to think about, please share it with your friends and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the depths of the world together. May God bless you and your loved ones, guiding your steps and keeping you safe from the hidden shadows of this life. If you believe in the power of a good heart and the grace of forgiveness to heal our deepest wounds, please write Amen in the comments below.
Thank you for listening, and always take care of each other.